January 12, 1945. The cobblestones of Aachen still held the frost of morning. The city lay broken, its medieval spires reduced to skeletal fingers clawing at a colorless sky. Smoke rose from the rubble in thin, ghostly columns, and the air carried the acrid smell of cordite mixed with something older, centuries of stone ground into powder. In the doorway of a collapsed bakery, an elderly woman sat motionless, her hands folded over tattered shawl. Her name was Margaret Kohler, 73 years old, and she had not moved in 2 days. The cold had settled into her bones. She had watched the Wehrmacht retreat 3 days earlier, their faces hollow, their boots echoing a rhythm of defeat. Now, she waited. For what? She no longer knew. Then came a different sound. Not the harsh clatter of hobnailed boots, but something softer, more deliberate. American voices, speaking in tones that seemed almost conversational. A young soldier appeared in her vision, his uniform bearing the patch of the 1st Infantry Division. He knelt before her, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. He said something in English she could not understand. Then, without hesitation, he slipped his arms beneath her frail shoulders and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. As he carried her toward a heated aid station, Margaret Kohler began to weep. Not from pain. Not from relief. But from something her ideology had told her was impossible. The enemy was gentle. This moment, repeated in dozens of German towns and cities throughout the winter and spring of 1945, would become one of the war's quietest revolutions. It was not decided in conference rooms or broadcast over radio networks. It occurred in doorways and cellars, in the careful hand of soldiers who had been taught to fight but who chose, in those crucial weeks, to carry instead. The doctrine had been absolute. For 12 years, the German people had been fed a narrative as carefully constructed as any military fortification. The Americans were mongrels, their society a chaotic mixture of inferior races, their soldiers undisciplined and weak, corrupted by jazz music and democratic softness. Goebbels had painted them as gangsters in uniform, motivated only by greed and violence. In schools, in newspapers, in the flickering images of cinema, the message had been consistent. When the Americans came, they would come as destroyers. The Untermensch from across the Atlantic, bringing with them the degeneracy of their plutocratic empire. German women, particularly, had been warned. Wehrmacht officers preparing for the defense of the homeland had circulated stories, some fabricated, some distorted from isolated incidents on the Eastern Front and projected westward. They spoke of mass atrocities, of systematic violations, of soldiers who would show no mercy to the elderly, the infirm, or the young. In the winter of 1944, as Allied forces crossed into German territory for the first time, thousands of civilians fled eastward in panic, choosing the uncertainty of refugee columns over the certainty of American occupation. Those who remained, often the elderly, the sick, those too weak or stubborn to leave, waited in their cellars with a dread that had been carefully cultivated by 12 years of propaganda. They hid what little food they had left. They concealed their daughters. They prepared, as best they could, for the barbarians at the gate. What arrived instead defied every prediction. The first American units to enter Western German cities in late 1944 and early 1945 encountered a civilian population paralyzed by fear and malnutrition. The final year of the war had been catastrophic for German civilians. Allied bombing had destroyed not just factories and rail lines but the infrastructure of daily survival. Food distribution networks had collapsed. Coal shipments that heated homes through brutal winters had ceased. In cities like Cologne, Aachen, and later Berlin, the elderly were dying not from violence but from cold and hunger, their bodies simply giving out after years of deprivation. The American military response was not what Nazi ideology had prepared anyone to expect. On January 15, 1945, in the city of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces, Captain Edward Mitchell of the 16th Infantry Regiment filed a report that would be echoed in dozens of similar accounts across the Western Front. His men, while conducting house-to-house clearance operations, had discovered an elderly couple trapped in the basement of their home. The stairway had collapsed during a bombing raid. The couple, both in their 80s, had been without food or water for 3 days. Mitchell's soldiers did not mark the house for later civilian authority attention. They did not pass the information up the chain of command and move on. Instead, 2 privates descended into the rubble, cleared debris by hand, and carried both elderly civilians to an American medical station where they were given water, food, and blankets. This was not an isolated act of individual conscience. It was, remarkably, pattern behavior. The German expectation had been shaped by projection. The Wehrmacht's conduct in occupied territories, particularly in Eastern Europe, had been marked by systematic brutality toward civilian populations. The elderly and infirm were considered burdens, obstacles to be removed or ignored. Einsatzgruppen reports from Poland and the Soviet Union documented with bureaucratic precision the murder of those deemed useless eaters. German military doctrine, influenced by social Darwinist ideology, valued strength and punished weakness. The old, in this calculus, had served their purpose. When they could no longer contribute to the war effort, they became invisible. This ideology assumed the enemy would operate from the same premises. If German soldiers would not waste resources on the elderly of conquered populations, surely the Americans would show even less mercy to German civilians. The propaganda that German women absorbed was rooted in this dark mirror, a projection of German conduct reflected back as inevitable American behavior. The reality shattered this assumption so completely that many Germans initially could not process what they were witnessing. In Düren, a city that had been 90% destroyed by Allied bombing in November 1944, American medics of the 102nd Infantry Division spent their first week of occupation not just treating wounded German soldiers but organizing care for elderly civilians trapped in ruins. They set up heated tents, requisitioned food from military supplies, and carried bedridden elderly to shelter. A German nurse, Helga Brandt, recorded in her diary an entry dated February 3, 1945, "Today I watched an American soldier, no more than 20 years old, spend an hour feeding soup to Frau Werner, who is 91 and partially paralyzed. He could not speak German. She could not speak English. He simply sat with her, spoon after spoon, until the bowl was empty. I have been taught that these men are monsters. I do not know what to believe anymore." The symbolic weight of the act, carrying, cannot be understated. In German military culture, shaped by Prussian traditions and Nazi ideology, physical strength was meant to be deployed for conquest. The strong dominated the weak. Resources flowed to those who could fight. To carry someone who could not contribute to victory was to waste strength, to misallocate resources, to indulge in sentimentality that had no place in total war. When American soldiers lifted elderly German women and men into their arms, they were not just providing physical assistance. They were demonstrating a fundamentally different understanding of what strength was for. The act of carrying, one human being supporting another at their most vulnerable, represented something the Nazi ideology had spent 12 years attempting to extinguish: the idea that the measure of a civilization was how it treated those who could offer nothing in return. The GIs who performed these acts were not specially trained humanitarian workers. They were combat soldiers, many of whom had fought their way across France and Belgium, who had lost friends at Omate Beach or in the Hürtgen forest, who had every reason to view German civilians with suspicion or hostility. Yet the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. In Krefeld, in Mönchengladbach, in scores of smaller towns, American soldiers finding elderly Germans trapped, starving, or freezing did not pass by. They stopped. They carried. They shared. Private First Class Robert Yoshida, a Japanese-American soldier with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, wrote to his sister in March 1945, "Today we found an old man, must have been 80, sitting in the ruins of his house. He was trying to eat frozen turnips. He looked at us with such fear I thought he might die from that alone. Johnson gave him a chocolate bar. The old man cried. Then Johnson picked him up, this old German man who probably thought we were demons, and carried him on his back half a mile to where the Red Cross had set up. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on that old man's face. Like he was seeing something that couldn't exist." The contrasts multiplied with every encounter. German women, emerging from cellars after days or weeks of hiding, found themselves facing not the predicted chaos but something uncomfortably close to order. American soldiers establishing control of captured cities did not loot systematically or destroy wantonly. Instead, they often began with infrastructure, restoring water supplies, clearing streets, establishing food distribution points. The elderly, in particular, became unexpected beneficiaries of American logistical capacity. The United States military in 1945 was the most abundantly supplied force in human history. The industrial output that had produced 50,000 tanks and 300,000 aircraft had also generated a supply chain of staggering depth. American soldiers carried with them not just ammunition but chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned goods, coffee, sugar, items that had disappeared from German civilian life years earlier. What shocked German civilians was not just that Americans had these things, but that they shared them, often with the most economically useless recipients, the very old. Margaret Steiner, a 70-year-old widow in Cologne, recorded in March 1945 an encounter that she described as impossible to reconcile with everything we were told. American soldiers clearing her neighborhood found her attempting to boil potato peels for soup. Rather than ignoring her or confiscating her meager supplies, they returned an hour later with canned meat, powdered milk, and real coffee. One soldier, through a translator, explained that his grandmother was her age. Before leaving, 2 of the soldiers carried her bed from an upper floor to the ground level of her damaged home so she would not have to climb stairs. They treated me, she wrote, as if I were valuable. As if my life, at 70 years with nothing to offer them, still mattered. This is not what we were taught about the enemy. The ideological crisis this created cannot be overstated. The Nazi regime had staked its legitimacy on a comprehensive worldview. It was not enough to claim German superiority. The inferiority of others, particularly Americans, had to be demonstrated as obvious truth. The American soldier was supposed to be proof of democratic decay, poorly trained, racially mixed, motivated by materialism rather than idealism, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that defined the German warrior. Every elderly German carried to safety by an American soldier was a brick removed from that ideological foundation. If the Americans were degenerate, why were they gentle? If their mixed society produced weakness, why were their soldiers strong enough to show mercy? If democracy made men selfish, why were they sharing their abundance with enemy civilians? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Hilda Thaler, a 58-year-old woman in Wurzburg, wrote in April 1945, "I watched American Negro soldiers, men we were taught to consider barely human, spend an entire afternoon helping Herr Braun, who is 76 and blind, salvage belongings from his destroyed home. They called him Sir. They made jokes to make him smile. When they finished, they gave him cigarettes and chocolate. I stood there thinking, everything I believed is a lie. If this is what we called inferior, what does that make us?" The documented evidence accumulated. Allied psychological warfare units, recognizing the propaganda value, began interviewing German civilians in occupied territories. The testimonies, preserved in National Archives files, reveal a consistent pattern. Elderly Germans described American soldiers with words like careful, gentle, respectful. They noted the frequency with which Americans would physically assist them, carrying groceries, moving furniture, helping them navigate rubble-strewn streets. Many expressed shock that Americans bothered to help them at all. One interview transcript from May 1945, conducted in Heidelberg, captured the transformation in stark terms. The subject, Emma Fogel, 71. "When they came, I prayed for death. I had heard what soldiers do. But this American boy, he could not have been more than 19, he found me trying to carry water up from the river. My back is not good. I was spilling more than I kept. He took the buckets from me. He filled them at the river. He carried them to my room. He came back the next day and the day after. For a week, this boy carried water for an old German woman. Why? I was the enemy. I am useless. But he carried my water. I do not understand their system that produces such men." Military medical records provide quantitative evidence of this pattern. The 29th Infantry Division medical logs from March 1945 show that approximately 15% of patients treated at forward aid stations were German civilians, most of them elderly. This occurred despite standing orders that prioritized military casualties. Medics, often acting on their own initiative, treated German civilians suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and untreated chronic conditions. The pattern repeated across divisions and corps. Food became the recurring symbol of the gulf between systems. German civilians, after years of rationing that had grown progressively more severe, were often on the edge of starvation by war's end. The Nazi ration system had been efficient until strategic bombing destroyed distribution networks, but even before that, it had been coldly utilitarian. Those who could not work received minimal rations. The elderly, no longer productive, were low priority. American abundance seemed almost obscene by comparison. GIs consumed daily rations that exceeded what many German civilians saw in a week. K rations and C rations, considered barely acceptable by American standards, contained meat, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, luxuries that had vanished from German life. The sight of American soldiers casually giving away food, particularly to German elderly, became one of the most powerful symbols of the difference between the systems. In Frankfurt, in May 1945, a chaplain's assistant named David Roth organized what his unit called grandmother dinners. Soldiers would identify elderly German women living alone and invite them to the unit's mess area, where they were served hot meals from American field kitchens. The first dinner served 12 women. Within a week, it had grown to 40. Roth wrote in a letter home, "These old women, they sit there with tears running down their faces, eating real meat and potatoes, drinking real coffee with real sugar. Some of them haven't eaten this well in years. And I think about how we were taught to hate the enemy. But these aren't the enemy. They're just old women who are hungry. So we feed them. It seems like the least we can do." The transformation in perception was rapid but not universal. Not all German civilians immediately shed their ideological conditioning. Some remained deeply suspicious of American intentions, seeing kindness as a trick or temporary aberration. Hardcore Nazi believers, particularly younger women who had been raised entirely under the regime, sometimes rejected American assistance or reinterpreted it through paranoid frameworks. But for many elderly Germans, the disconnect between prediction and reality was too stark to ignore. The elderly, in particular, had memories that predated Nazi indoctrination. They remembered a Germany before Hitler, before the totalitarian machinery had reconfigured every social relationship according to race and utility. When American soldiers showed them kindness, they could recognize it as something genuine rather than anomalous. Many explicitly compared American behavior favorably not just to what they had been told to expect, but to how they had been treated by their own government in the war's final years, abandoned in cities being bombed to ruins, left to starve as the regime prioritized military units, written off as expendable in the calculus of total war. Frieda Mannheim, 74, interviewed in June 1945. The Americans who occupy my city treat me better than my own government did in its final year. They carried me to safety when my building was struck by artillery. They bring me food. They fixed my roof. The soldiers of the Führer, when they retreated, took what little food I had left. They told me it was for the war effort. The Americans, who owe me nothing, who I was told would murder me, give me chocolate and ask if I need medicine. What does this say about everything we believed? The symbolism extended beyond physical acts. American soldiers did not just carry elderly Germans to safety, they carried them gently. They spoke to them respectfully, often using formal address even when no translator was present, communicating through tone and gesture. They did not hurry. They did not show irritation or disgust. For elderly Germans accustomed to Nazi ideology that viewed them as burdens at best, this basic respect was as shocking as the physical assistance itself. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a German physician who worked with American medical units in occupied Aachen, noted in his journal, "The American medics treat elderly German patients with the same care they give their own wounded. I have watched them spend 20 minutes carefully bandaging the ulcerated leg of an 80-year-old woman, speaking gently to her though she understands no English, ensuring she is comfortable before moving to the next patient. This is not battlefield medicine. This is humanity. I trained in a system that taught medical resources should be allocated by utility and genetic value." These Americans seem to operate from a different premise entirely, that the old woman's suffering matters as much as anyone else's. The contrast with Eastern Front conduct was deliberately emphasized. As the full scope of Nazi atrocities became known, American psychological warfare units began making explicit comparisons in their propaganda directed at remaining German forces and civilians. Leaflets contrasted photographs of American soldiers helping German elderly with documented evidence of Wehrmacht brutality toward civilian populations in occupied territories. The message was clear: American democracy produced soldiers who protected the weak, Nazi ideology produced soldiers who murdered them. This propaganda was devastatingly effective precisely because it aligned with German civilians' lived experience. By April and May 1945, millions of Germans in the Western zones were directly observing American behavior. The propaganda wrote itself. Elderly Germans became, in a sense, witnesses for the prosecution against the regime that had ruled them for 12 years. The theological implications troubled German consciences. Germany was a predominantly Christian nation, and the tension between Christian ethics and Nazi ideology had been a quiet crisis throughout the regime. The elderly had always posed a particular theological problem. Christian doctrine held that every life had inherent value, that the weak should be protected, that mercy was virtue. Nazi ideology explicitly rejected these premises as sentimental weakness. When American soldiers carried elderly Germans to safety, many Germans recognized the act as fundamentally Christian, in a way their own nation had ceased to be. American GIs, many of whom wore crosses around their necks or carried Bibles in their packs, were demonstrating mercy as active practice rather than abstract doctrine. The chaplains who often accompanied American units and organized assistance for German civilians made the connection explicit. Father George Murphy, a Catholic chaplain with the Third Army, wrote in April 1945, "I find myself explaining to German civilians that American soldiers help them because they believe all human life has value. They are shocked by this. Some cry. One old woman told me through a translator that she had not heard such ideas in many years. She said, 'You speak of old truths. It breaks my heart that mercy has become strange to them.'" By late spring 1945, the pattern was undeniable. Across the American occupation zones, elderly Germans were being treated not as obstacles or enemies but as humans in need. The contrast with both Nazi ideology and German expectations was total. The regime had spent 12 years constructing a vision of Americans as degenerate savages. Millions of Germans had now personally witnessed the opposite. The long-term consequences of this disconnect would shape post-war German development in profound ways. The Western zones, occupied by American, British, and French forces who generally treated civilians humanely, would become the foundation of democratic West Germany. The Eastern zones, occupied by Soviet forces whose conduct often confirmed the worst propaganda predictions, would become communist East Germany. The divergence was not accidental. German civilians in the West had experienced something that made democratic systems comprehensible in a way propaganda never could: They had been shown mercy by representatives of democracy when their own totalitarian system had abandoned them. The individual stories accumulated into collective memory. Decades after the war, elderly Germans who had been carried to safety, fed by American soldiers, or treated in American medical stations would speak of those moments as transformative. They described them in almost mystical terms, as encounters that broke through years of propaganda and revealed fundamental truths about human nature and political systems. Gertrude Becker, interviewed in 1989 at age 91, recalled being carried from her cellar by an African-American soldier in April 1945. "I had been taught that such men were subhuman. I believed it because I knew nothing else. Then this man I was told to hate and fear, lifted me as though I were precious. He carried me as a father carries a child. He smiled at me. He gave me water. In that moment, everything I had been taught became dust. I understood that I had been lied to. About him. About his people. About America. About everything. That soldier saved more than my body that day. He saved my mind from the lies." The American soldiers themselves rarely understood the ideological earthquake they were causing. For most GIs, helping an elderly German woman to safety was simply the decent thing to do. They had been raised in a culture that, despite its profound flaws and hypocrisies, had embedded certain values about how to treat the elderly. You respected your elders. You helped those weaker than yourself. You didn't let old people suffer when you could prevent it. These were not sophisticated political principles, they were basic social norms carried from American hometowns to European battlefields. What the American soldiers did not fully grasp was that these basic decencies, so ordinary to them, were revolutionary demonstrations to people who had been systematically taught that decency was weakness. Each casual act of kindness toward a German grandmother was a small detonation in the architecture of totalitarian ideology. The recurring image, the soldier carrying the elderly civilian, became emblematic. In photographs, in testimonies, in diaries and letters, the image repeated itself. A young American soldier, often exhausted and dirty from combat, lifting an elderly German woman or man with careful strength. Sometimes the elderly person is clearly afraid. Sometimes they are weeping. Sometimes they show stunned disbelief. The soldier's face typically shows simple concentration, the expression of someone performing a necessary task without drama. These images, preserved in archives and family collections, captured something profound about the collision of ideologies. The soldier carries not just a person but the possibility that everything the person had been taught was wrong. The gentle strength demonstrated in the act, strength used to protect rather than dominate, embodied a different vision of what power was for. The epilogue of this story extends far beyond 1945. The German women and men who were carried to safety by American soldiers became witnesses to their children and grandchildren. They transmitted not academic arguments about democracy versus totalitarianism, but visceral memories of how each system treated human vulnerability. When they spoke of the war, they often returned to these moments, the unexpected gentleness, the shared food, the soldier who carried them when their own strength failed. These memories became part of the foundation of post-war German democracy. They were not the only factor. The Marshall Plan, political reconstruction, the Cold War context all played crucial roles, but they were significant. Millions of Germans had experienced American presence not as conquerors extracting revenge but as liberators offering mercy. This experiential knowledge made the American model comprehensible and attractive in a way that propaganda alone could never achieve. The elderly Germans who were carried to safety in the spring of 1945 lived on average another 20 or 30 years. Many of them witnessed the transformation of West Germany into a prosperous democracy. Some acknowledged explicitly that their positive memories of American soldiers influenced their acceptance of democratic values. They had seen, in the most direct way possible, that the system that produced gentle soldiers might be worth embracing. The truth revealed in those acts of carrying remains resonant. Totalitarian ideologies attempt to reconfigure human nature according to abstract principles: race, class, national destiny. They teach that mercy is weakness, that the vulnerable are burdensome, that strength should dominate rather than protect. The Nazi regime had spent 12 years trying to make Germans believe these things. When American soldiers lifted elderly Germans into their arms and carried them to safety, they demonstrated a simple counter-truth: that human decency was stronger than ideology, that mercy was not weakness but choice, that a system could be judged by how it treated those who could offer nothing in return. The elderly German women who wept as they were carried by enemy soldiers understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, what was happening. They were witnessing the collapse of the lies they had been told. They were experiencing the reality that their ideology had insisted was impossible, that the so-called inferior democratic system produced men who were strong enough to be gentle, abundant enough to share, and confident enough to show mercy. In the ruins of cities destroyed by total war, in the careful hands of young soldiers far from home, a different kind of victory was won, not over territory or armies, but over the idea that cruelty was strength and compassion was decay. The soldiers who carried elderly Germans to safety were not trying to make ideological arguments. They were simply doing what seemed right. But in those simple acts, they demonstrated a truth more powerful than 1,000 propaganda films: that freedom produces not chaos but compassion, that abundance generates not decadence but generosity, and that the measure of any civilization is found in how it treats those who cannot fight back. The cobblestones of Aachen, frozen that January morning in 1945, felt the weight of many burdens, of history, of war, of ideology in ruins. But they also felt something unexpected: the careful footsteps of a soldier carrying an old woman to warmth and safety, carrying her gently, carrying her as though she mattered. In that simple act, repeated countless times across the rubble of a fallen regime, the future was being written. Not with grand declarations or political treaties, but with the quiet strength of mercy, one elderly life carried to safety at a time.